This is a clay tablet sitting in a museum right now that most people will never hear about. It fits in the palm of your hand. The surface is covered in tiny, wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay by a reed stylus, marks that were made when the pyramids of Egypt were still relatively new, when the city of Troy had not yet been built. When the ancestors of the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, when all of them were still wandering in scattered villages, barely leaving a trace on the archaeological record. This tablet is 4,000 years old, maybe older, and it tells a story. Two brothers, one a farmer, one a shepherd. A divine power is asked to choose between them. One is favored, one is rejected. The rejected one's story ends in blood. Does that sound familiar? It should. But here is the thing that is going to stay with you long after tonight. That story was not written in Hebrew. It was not written by the authors of Genesis. It was not recorded in the Holy Land or in the desert or in any of the places we associate with the Bible. It was written in Sumer, in a language so ancient that it was already dead for 1,000 years before Abraham was born. Pressed into clay in a city whose name most people cannot even pronounce, Uruk, Nippur, Ur, cities that were already legendary ruins by the time Moses led anyone anywhere. The story of Cain and Abel is one of the most famous stories in the world. 16 verses, the first murder, the first act of jealousy so deep it becomes destruction. Every culture that inherited the Bible inherited this story, carried it forward. I folded it into art and law and philosophy and conscience. But what if that story is an echo? What if the original voice came from somewhere older? Something buried, something that sat silent beneath thousands of years of desert sand until a group of 19th century archaeologists, digging for something else entirely, cracked it open again. And what if, here is the part that really should make you sit up, what if the parallels between that older story and Genesis are not vague and general, but specific, structural, almost disturbingly precise? That is what we are going to explore tonight. Not to prove anything, not to tear anything down, but to follow a thread that goes further back than most people ever look. Into the darkness before writing itself. Into a world of shepherd gods and grain goddesses and divine favorites. A world that shaped the stories we think of as ours. So, let us start at the beginning. Not the biblical beginning, the other one. There are rooms in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in the Oriental Institute in Chicago, in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, rooms full of clay tablets, stacked and labeled and carefully preserved, that most visitors walk past without a second glance. They are looking at the statues, the gold, the dramatic carvings of winged bulls and royal hunts. But the tablets are the real miracle, because a clay tablet is almost indestructible. Stone crumbles, metal rusts, wood rots, paper burns, but fire clay, clay that has been hardened by the heat of the fires that destroyed the libraries it was stored in. Fire clay survives. The very thing that burned the building preserved the books inside it. It is one of history's more satisfying ironies. The cities of ancient Sumer were destroyed so many times by floods and wars and the slow grinding entropy of civilizations, and every time they burned, the libraries inside them became more permanent. So those tablets waited. Patient in a way that human beings cannot manage to be. patient for 4,000 years, patient through the rise and fall of every empire in the ancient world, patient through the birth of Islam, through the Mongol invasions, through the Ottoman centuries. And then, in the mid-1800s, the European archaeologists came, and the tablets started talking again. What they said was unexpected. It was not just that the stories were old. It was that the stories were familiar. The flood, the garden, the creation, the choice between a farmer and a shepherd that ended in tragedy. All of it there. All of it older than anyone had suspected. All of it waiting in clay to be heard. Tonight, we are going to hear it. The year is 1845. A young British diplomat named Austen Henry Layard is standing in the Iraqi desert, staring at a mound of dirt. He is not supposed to be excavating. He has no formal training. He barely has funding. But he has a hunch, one of those hunches that, in retrospect, we call genius, that something enormous is buried beneath his feet. He starts digging. What he finds is not what he was looking for. Nobody was looking for Sumer, the archaeologists and explorers who poured into Mesopotamia in the mid-1800s, and they came in waves: French, British, American, German. They were mostly looking for confirmation. They wanted to find the places mentioned in the Bible. They wanted to prove that Nineveh existed, that Babylon was real, that the ancient world their scriptures described had actually been there. What they found instead was something deeper, older, something that had no name in any text they had ever read, because the people who built it had been so completely forgotten that even their name had vanished. The first clue was the writing. Every excavation was turning up clay tablets by the thousands, tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands. The tablets were covered in the same wedge-shaped marks that had been noticed on Persian monuments for years, a script scholars had taken to calling cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. The Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all had used versions of this script, but these tablets were different, older. The cuneiform on them was more primitive in some ways, more complex in others, and the language beneath the script was not related to anything the scholars could identify. Babylonian cuneiform encoded a Semitic language, related at a great distance to Hebrew and Arabic. Scholars could work with that. They had reference points, but the language on these deeper, older tablets was not Semitic. It was not Indo-European. It was not related to any language family that anyone had ever cataloged. It was a language isolate, a linguistic island with no known relatives, no surviving descendants, and no living speakers. The people who had spoken it were gone. Their cities were rubble. Their religion had been absorbed and transformed by every subsequent civilization in Mesopotamia. Even their name, Sumerian, was not something they called themselves. It was a term derived from the Akkadian word for their land, Sumer. Sumer, the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the cradle of something. But of what exactly? The decipherment came slowly, painfully slowly. Scholars compared tablets. They cross-referenced with bilingual Akkadian Sumerian texts, ancient scribal dictionaries and glossaries that Babylonian students had used to learn the older language, the way a medieval student might have studied Latin. They found god lists and king lists and administrative records, and bit by bit, like restoring a mosaic from shards found in different rooms of a ruined house, they began to reconstruct the language. By the 1890s, Sumerian could be read again, not perfectly. Debates about specific words and grammatical constructions continue to this day, but well enough that the stories could be heard. And those stories were shocking. There was a flood story. A righteous man warned by a god to build a great boat. Animals brought aboard. Waters covering the earth. Birds sent out to search for dry land. The parallels to Noah were not subtle. They were structural, specific, almost word for word in places. There were creation stories, paradise gardens, divine councils making decisions about humanity, a great serpent, humans shaped from clay, and there was a story about a shepherd and a farmer, a divine choice, a rivalry, one favored, one rejected. The scholarly world sat with this information like a man who has just been told something he cannot quite process. If these stories predated the Bible, and they clearly did, by a minimum of 1,000 years, sometimes 2,000, then what did that mean? It meant the stories we thought were unique were not unique. It meant the stories we thought were original had predecessors. It meant that somewhere between the reed marshes of ancient Sumer and the scrolls of ancient Israel, a transmission had occurred, a handoff, a reshaping, and the question that has haunted scholars ever since is simple. How? How does a story travel from a civilization that no one in the ancient world could read anymore, whose language had been dead for centuries before Genesis was composed? How does that story leave its fingerprints on a text written in a completely different language, by a completely different people, in a completely different theological framework? That is the mystery we are chasing tonight. But before we can chase it, we need to understand what the tablets actually say. We need to meet the Sumerians on their own terms, not as a footnote in biblical scholarship, not as a curiosity, but as what they actually were. The first civilization in recorded human history, the inventors of writing itself, the people who, 4,000 years before anyone heard of Cain and Abel, were already asking the same questions about divine favor, human jealousy, and what happens when a brother you love becomes someone you cannot forgive. Let us go back further, to the very beginning of the written word, to the moment when humanity first pressed thought into clay and discovered that memory could outlast the body. Around 3,400 BCE, in the city of Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, something happened that changed everything. Someone figured out that you could press a reed stylus into wet clay and make marks. Not just pictures, though pictures came first, but marks that could represent sounds, ideas, abstract concepts. A mark for a word. A mark for a syllable. A system that could be taught, refined, improved, and passed from teacher to student across generations. The first tablets we have are accounting records. How much grain in the temple storehouse? How many sheep belonging to which official? Transactions, inventories, debts. The most revolutionary technology in human history was invented, as far as we can tell, to keep track of livestock. But within a few hundred years, the Sumerians were writing everything: medical texts, legal codes, love poetry, laments for dead cities, hymns to the moon, arguments about philosophy, and, most importantly, for us tonight, myths, stories about their gods and how the world came to be, about great heroes who did impossible things, about the moments when divine and human intersected. These stories were not casual entertainments. They were sacred literature. They were preserved in temple libraries and scribal schools, copied and recopied by generations of students, treated with the kind of reverence that later cultures would reserve for their own holy texts. They were also, it turns out, extraordinarily durable. When the cities fell, and they fell many times, to drought, to invasion, to the slow entropy of civilizations, the tablets survived. Buried under rubble, sealed in collapsed archives, preserved by the dry desert soil, they waited. They waited through the rise and fall of Babylon, through the Assyrian Empire, through the Persian conquest, through Alexander, through Rome, through the Islamic caliphates, through the Ottoman Empire. They waited 4,000 years for someone to learn to read them again. And when that someone finally came, when those 19th century scholars cracked the code and the old voices started speaking again, what they found would reshape everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization's most fundamental stories, including the one about two brothers and a choice that ended in blood. There is a phrase that scholars of the ancient Near East use that I want you to hold on to tonight. Scribal culture. In the ancient world, in Sumer, in Babylon, in Assyria, eventually in Egypt, and then in the Levant, the ability to read and write was not a basic skill the way it is now. It was a specialized craft taught in schools attached to temples and palaces, passed from master scribes to their students over years of intensive study. Scribal schools had curricula. They had textbooks. They had the ancient equivalent of a literary canon, a set of great works that every educated person was expected to know. And among those canonical works, in the scribal schools of Mesopotamia, from roughly 2500 BCE onward, were the great mythological texts, the creation stories, the flood stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hymns to Inanna, and the stories about the shepherd and the farmer. When you understand this, the transmission question becomes clearer. These stories were not folk tales passed informally from mouth to ear. They were assigned reading in the educational institutions of the ancient world. They were practiced by students who copied them onto tablets as exercises in language and calligraphy. They were known. In the way that educated people know canonical literature, with the automatic intimacy of something read and reread since childhood. And scribal culture, once established, was extraordinarily durable. Babylonian scribes learned Sumerian, a language that had ceased to be spoken in daily life, the way medieval European scholars learned Latin, as a prestige language, as the language of sacred tradition, as the key to the oldest and most authoritative texts. So the Sumerian stories were not lost when the Sumerian language died as a spoken tongue. They were preserved and studied and taught in Akkadian-speaking schools for centuries. They were alive, just in a different language. And that aliveness, that ongoing, institutionalized, pedagogically enforced presence of Sumerian mythological tradition in the educated culture of Mesopotamia is the mechanism through which these stories could have reached Israel, not through a single dramatic moment of revelation, not through one scribe reading one tablet and having a conversion experience, through the slow, invisible, centuries-long osmosis of ideas through a literate culture, through the scribal school, through the curriculum, through the assigned reading, through the way that a story, once it enters the educational canon of a civilization, never quite leaves. Her name was Inanna. In Sumerian mythology, she was the queen of heaven, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war. Yes, all of those things at once. And if that combination seems contradictory to you, you are not thinking like a Sumerian. In the ancient Near East, love and war were not opposites. They were expressions of the same overwhelming, world-shaping force. Inanna was that force. She was one of the most powerful deities in the Sumerian pantheon, worshipped in temples across the land, the subject of more surviving literature than almost any other figure in Mesopotamian religion. She had hymns, she had laments, she had stories, she had a personality, proud, passionate, sometimes reckless, always formidable. And in one of the oldest stories we have about her, she had to make a choice. Two men came to her, two suitors, both offering gifts, both making their case, both wanting to be chosen. The first was Enkimdu, a farmer, a cultivator of the rich river-bottom soil between the Tigris and Euphrates. His hands knew the weight of seed grain. His body knew the rhythm of planting and harvest. He could offer bread and beer, the staples of Sumerian civilization, the products of patient, deliberate, organized agricultural work. He represented the settled life, walls and warehouses and irrigation canals, and the deep security of knowing where your food was coming from. The second was Dumuzi, a shepherd. He moved with his flocks across the open landscape, following the grass, reading the seasons in the behavior of his animals. He could offer milk fresh from the morning milking, rich cream, fine wool, the warm abundance of a pastoral life lived close to the land. Inanna's brother, Utu the sun god, urged her to choose the shepherd. But Inanna hesitated. She pushed back. She told him, and the tablets preserve her exact words across multiple versions, that she preferred the farmer, that the farmer brought her bread and beer, that the farmer made the orchards flourish, that the farmer represented abundance, stability, permanence. Why would she want a shepherd? This is the moment in the story where something important happens, something that sets the Sumerian version apart from what comes later. Dumuzi objects. But he does not rage. He does not rise up in violence. He makes an argument. What does the farmer have that I do not have? He asks. If he gives you black garments, I will give you white ones. If he gives you grain, I will give you fine wool. If he pours you beer, I will pour you sweet milk. If he gives you bread, I will give you cheese and honey. If he gives you what he grows in a field, I will give you what runs in my flocks. It is a formal debate, a competition of eloquence, two ways of life making their case before a divine judge, not with weapons, but with words. And Enkimdu, the farmer, does something remarkable. He does not escalate. He does not meet the shepherd's challenge with anger. He backs down. He concedes. He tells Dumuzi, "Why should we fight? Your sheep can graze in my fields. Your flocks can drink from my irrigation canals. In this city, in Uruk, my city and yours, farmer and shepherd can live together in peace." And that is what happens. No murder, no blood, no curse from the sky. Inanna chooses Dumuzi. The shepherd wins the goddess, and the farmer, the one who lost the competition, walks away. Not dead. Not cursed, just not chosen. Now, I want you to hold that resolution in your mind, because we are going to come back to it. The parallels to Cain and Abel are already visible. A farmer, a shepherd, divine favor hanging in the balance, one chosen and one not. But the ending is completely different. The Sumerian story ends in negotiation. It ends in coexistence. It ends with a losing side gracefully accepting the outcome and offering cooperation instead of conflict. In Genesis, the losing side picks up a rock. Why? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the actual scholarly question that has been debated for a century and a half since the Sumerian tablets were first translated. What changed between these two versions of the same fundamental story? What shifted in the cultural transmission, whether through direct borrowing or parallel development, that turned the Sumerian ending of negotiation and peace into the biblical ending of murder and exile? Some scholars think the answer is theological. The God of Genesis is not a goddess who can be charmed by arguments about milk and wool. He is a singular, absolute, moral deity whose preferences carry the full weight of divine judgment. When he rejects Cain's offering, there is no appeal process. There is no argument to be made. The rejection is total, and it produces a corresponding totality of despair. Others think the answer is sociological. By the time Genesis was composed, the tension between farming and herding cultures had escalated to a point that the Sumerian myth, written when both lifestyles coexisted in relative balance, I could no longer contain. The story needed to be bigger. It needed to carry more weight. And weight, in storytelling, often means blood. Still, others point to something simpler and darker: human nature. Given enough time, given enough retellings, stories about rivalry tend to drift toward violence. Because violence is memorable. Violence is the punctuation mark that makes a story stick. We will explore all of these theories before the night is over. But first, let us stay with the Sumerian story a little longer. Because Dumuzi's story does not end with his victory over Enkimdu. It does not end with the goddess's favor and a happy pastoral life. It ends in the underworld. And that is where the story starts to bleed. The shepherd's rivalry with the farmer was only the first chapter. The second chapter is darker by a magnitude that is hard to prepare for. And it is in that second chapter, in the death of the shepherd god Dumuzi, that the echo between the Sumerian tradition and the biblical story of Abel becomes most haunting. But before we go there, we need to understand something about the world the Sumerians lived in. Because to understand why these stories mattered so much, why they were written down, preserved, copied, taught to students, sung in temples, you have to understand what the Sumerians were actually worried about. And they were worried about almost everything. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates is generous, but it is not safe. The rivers flood unpredictably. The rains fail without warning. The soil that produces such abundance in good years can crack and harden in drought. And the border between the settled agricultural world and the pastoral world beyond the walls, that border was not stable. It was contested. It was violent. It was, in the deepest sense, political. Sumerian cities were islands of grain in a sea of grassland. Beyond their irrigation canals, Beyond their walls and their temples, the steppe stretched out in every direction, grazed by the flocks of people who lived differently, moved differently, thought differently. Sometimes those people traded, sometimes they raided. The relationship between the city and the nomadic pastoralist was one of the defining tensions of Mesopotamian life. So, when the Sumerians wrote stories about a farmer and a shepherd competing for a goddess's favor, they were not being abstractly mythological. They were processing something real, something they lived with every day. The question of which way of life is more worthy, the question of which kind of human the divine prefers, the question of whether you can negotiate your way through a rivalry, or whether the rivalry is so deep that negotiation will always eventually fail. Those questions are not Sumerian questions. They are human questions, and we are still asking them. Let me describe what Dumuzi's debate with Enkimdu actually looked like, because the tablets are more specific than most summaries suggest. This was not a casual argument. In Sumerian culture, formal debates, disputation literature, scholars call it, were a recognized genre. There are debates preserved in cuneiform between summer and winter, between the hoe and the plow, between silver and copper, between bird and fish. These are not just rhetorical exercises, though they functioned as that in scribal schools. They are expressions of a culture that believed the fundamental questions of life. Which way is better? Which force is stronger? Which offering is more worthy? Could be approached through structured, formal argument. So, when Dumuzi and Enkimdu debate before Inanna, they are not just bickering. They are engaging in a recognized cultural form. They are making the best possible case for their way of life, knowing that Inanna, and through her, the gods, and through the gods, the cosmic order, will hear them and judge. Enkimdu's case was substantial. As a farmer, he could offer stability. He could offer grain, the foundation of Sumerian civilization. He could offer beer, which in Sumer was not a frivolity, but a staple calorie source, particularly for the large numbers of people who worked on temple estates and were paid in rations. He could offer bread and oil and the products of a settled, organized agricultural economy. He represented the city, the ziggurat, the temple storeroom. Dumuzi's case was different. He was not arguing that pastoral life was more stable or more abundant in the agricultural sense. He was arguing that it was richer in a different way. His gifts, milk, cream, butter, wool, meat, came from a living system, a self-renewing system. His flocks produced new lambs every year. His dairy animals gave milk every day. The pastoral economy was more flexible, more resilient in some ways, more connected to the living rhythms of the natural world. And there was something else in Dumuzi's argument, a claim that is easy to miss if you are reading quickly. Freedom. The farmer is tied to his fields. The shepherd moves. He knows the landscape in a way the farmer never can. The water sources, the sheltered valleys, the paths that stay passable through the winter. He is not just a food producer. He is a kind of geographic knowledge, a living map of the world beyond the walls. In a civilization as dependent on trade and communication as Sumer was, in a world where the routes between cities were as important as the cities themselves, that knowledge had value. The shepherd who moved between communities was also, often, the carrier of news, of rumors, of stories. the connection between the pastoral world and the transmission of ideas across distances was not accidental. So when Inanna ultimately chose Dumuzi, she was not just choosing milk over grain. She was choosing movement over stasis, connection over enclosure, the world beyond the walls over the world within them. And when that choice was later reversed, when the Hebrew version of the story had God choose the shepherd's offering and then let the shepherd be killed, had the farmer win the world, perhaps the reversal was not just theological. Perhaps it was geographical, historical, the mapping of an actual historical change onto a mythological template. The walls won, the city won, the grain won. But the story stayed on the side of the shepherd. Inanna decided to go to the underworld. The tablets do not give us one single clean explanation for why. Some versions suggest she wanted to expand her power, to rule the land of the dead as she ruled the land of the living. Others hint at a challenge, a confrontation with her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, a figure as dark and absolute as Inanna was brilliant and vital. Whatever the reason, the decision was catastrophic, because the underworld in Sumerian mythology was not a place of reward or peace or quiet rest. It was the land of no return, dust and darkness, ash and silence. The dead wore feathered garments and ate clay. There was no light, no sound, no joy. There was only the weight of absence. To travel there, you passed through 7 gates. At each gate, a garment or an ornament was stripped away. A crown, a lapis lazuli necklace, a breastplate, a gold ring, all the markers of power and identity removed one by one until you stood before the judges of the dead with nothing. Inanna descended through all 7 gates. She stood before the 7 judges, the Anunnaki, and they fixed their eyes on her. They spoke a word against her. And Inanna, the queen of heaven, the most powerful goddess in the Sumerian pantheon, died. The effect was immediate and total. With the goddess of love and fertility gone, the world stopped working. Grain would not grow. Animals would not breed. Couples who wanted to conceive found they could not. The flow of life itself faltered, stuttered, began to run dry. The gods intervened. Through a complex series of bargains and negotiations, through the efforts of Inanna's faithful servant, Ninshubur, who had sounded the alarm, a rescue was arranged. But there was a price. Nobody leaves the underworld for free. The rule was absolute. If Inanna went back up, someone else had to go down in her place. And so Inanna rose from the land of no return, escorted by a troop of demons called the Gala, creatures of the underworld with no mercy, no sympathy, no capacity for bribes or tears. Their job was to deliver a substitute, and they followed behind Inanna into the world of the living, waiting to seize whoever she chose. She passed through city after city. At every stop, she found the people in mourning, weeping, tearing their garments, sitting in the dust. They had been devastated by her absence. They loved her. They feared a world without her. To each of these mourners, Inanna showed mercy. She did not mark them for the underworld. Then she came to her own palace, and there, in the great hall of her home, she found Dumuzi, not in mourning, not in sackcloth and ashes, not weeping or tearing his hair. Dumuzi was sitting on a throne, dressed in fine garments, relaxed, feasting, While the world thought his wife was dead, while cities wept and fields withered, and the universe tipped toward extinction, the Shepherd King was eating well. That image has haunted readers of this text for 4,000 years, and it still haunts. It is the image of indifference in the face of catastrophe. It is the image of someone who did not show up when it mattered. And whether Inanna's fury at that moment was righteous or excessive, whether Dumuzi truly did not care or was simply coping in the only way he knew, the text does not stop to explain. It only tells us what happened next. Inanna pointed at Dumuzi, and she said, in essence, him. He goes in my place. The Gala seized him immediately. And now everything changes. Now the story becomes a hunt. Dumuzi ran. He called on his brother-in-law, the sun god Utu, to transform him, to change his hands into the hands of a serpent, his feet into the feet of a snake, so he could escape. Utu granted the transformation. Dumuzi fled. The Gala followed. He hid in a sheepfold. They found him. He fled to the house of a friend. They found him. His sister, Inanna, a figure of fierce loyalty who becomes one of the great tragic characters of Sumerian mythology, tried to shelter him. She offered herself as a substitute. She argued with the Gala. She wept and pleaded. It was not enough. The tablets describe what happens next in language that is, even in translation, viscerally brutal. The Gala were not like ordinary hunters. They knew no food. They knew no drink. They accepted no flower offerings. They did not enjoy libations of water. They could not be appeased. They could not be bought. They could not be moved by grief or love or argument. They caught Dumuzi, and they dragged him down. Some fragments of the text describe his final moments in physical terms: beaten, bound, his body broken, blood soaking into the ground. The Shepherd King, who had been chosen by the greatest goddess in heaven, who had debated a farmer and won, who had been the beloved of Inanna, brought low in the most total way imaginable, dragged to the land of no return. Now stop. I want you to feel the weight of what I just described. A shepherd, beloved of the divine, hunted down, killed, his blood soaking into the earth. Does that pattern sound familiar to you? Because in Genesis, the text tells us that after Cain kills Abel, after the first murder, after the first blood is spilled, God speaks to Cain. And what God says is this: "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The blood of the shepherd cries from the earth." In the Sumerian tradition, the death of the shepherd god Dumuzi becomes the explanation for the dying of the year, the scorching of summer, the withering of vegetation, the time when the flocks are thin and the fields are brown. Every year, in Sumerian temples, women wept for Dumuzi. Priests chanted laments. The city mourned the shepherd. Because his death and his partial, seasonal return were woven into the very fabric of how the Sumerians understood the cycle of life and death and renewal. His blood in the ground was not just tragedy, it was sacred. Abel's blood in the ground, in Genesis, cries out for justice. It is the voice of the victim demanding to be heard. And there is something sacred about that too. The idea that the earth itself cannot simply absorb violence and be silent. That the ground remembers. That the soil keeps score. Different theologies, different frameworks, different gods and different moral systems. But the same haunting image, the shepherd, dead, his blood speaking from the earth. I am not telling you this proves a direct connection. That case is more complicated, and we will get to it. What I am telling you is this. When you lay these two stories next to each other, when you let the Sumerian version and the Hebrew version sit side by side in your mind without forcing one to explain the other, something clicks, something resonates, a frequency that is older than either story individually, a note that was struck so long ago it has been ringing ever since. Why shepherds? Why does every version of this story reach for a shepherd when it needs a sacred victim? The answer is embedded in what shepherds actually were in the ancient world. They occupied a specific and strange position at the boundary of things. They lived at the edge of the settled world, close enough to trade, far enough to wander. They dealt in life and death constantly. The birth of lambs, the slaughter of animals for food and sacrifice, the constant negotiation with predators and weather and disease. They moved between worlds. In mythology, people who move between worlds tend to end up as sacrifices, or as gods, sometimes both. Dumuzi became both. His death was the cosmic sacrifice that sealed the fertility cycle. His partial return, his sister Geshtinana eventually negotiated a deal where she would spend half the year in the underworld, and Dumuzi, the other half, became the explanation for the seasons themselves. Abel did not become a god, but his blood became a kind of sacred complaint, the first in a long line of innocent deaths that the Bible tracks and mourns. And much later, in a theological tradition that grew out of Hebrew scripture, the image of the sacrificed shepherd would be invoked again in a story that would shape 2,000 years of history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, stay with the blood in the ground, stay with the gala in the dark and the shepherd who ran but could not hide. Stay with the pattern, because the pattern is older than any single story, and the pattern is what we are chasing. There is one more layer to the Dumuzi tradition that I need to tell you about before we move on. Something that most summaries leave out because it complicates the picture in an uncomfortable way. In some versions of the Dumuzi myth, fragmentary, damaged, disputed, there is a suggestion of betrayal. Not just divine judgment, not just Inanna's fury, not just the implacable mechanics of the underworld's rule, but human treachery. A figure close to Dumuzi who fails to protect him, who, in some readings, may actively hand him over. A brother figure, a companion. Someone who should have been his keeper. The tablets are too damaged, the references too oblique to make a clean case. Scholars argue about what these fragments mean, whether they are part of the same mythological cycle or interpolations from elsewhere. The evidence is suggestive, but not decisive. But think about what they suggest. Am I my brother's keeper? That is what Cain says to God when God asks where Abel is. That single line, sarcastic, defensive, refusing, has echoed through every courtroom and every confession for 3,000 years. Am I responsible for what happened to him? In the Sumerian fragments, someone may have been asking the same question, and the answer the story seems to lean toward, the answer that makes the tragedy complete, is yes. Yes, you were your brother's keeper, and you were not there. We do not know for certain. We may never know, but the question itself is as old as writing. The laments for Dumuzi are among the oldest poetry we have. They predate Homer by more than 1,000 years. They predate the Psalms. They predate almost every other sustained body of lyric poetry in the human record. And they are devastating. One of the most moving is preserved across several tablet fragments and is attributed to Dumuzi's wife, Inanna herself, as she mourns the husband she condemned. The irony is not lost on the tablets. The one who caused his death is also the one who mourns him most completely. She calls to the wilderness. She calls to the mountains. She asks where her shepherd has gone. She describes the sheepfold without its shepherd, the animals without their keeper. And in her grief, the landscape itself seems to grieve. The fields, the pastures, the desert paths, all somehow marked by the absence of the one who used to move through them. This is not a minor theme in Sumerian culture. This is one of the central rituals of the Mesopotamian year. Cities wept for Dumuzi. Women went to the temples and lamented. Priests performed elaborate ceremonies mourning the shepherd's descent. The entire culture organized itself around the acknowledgement that something essential had been lost and needed to be mourned year after year, indefinitely. Why? Partly because of the agricultural cycle. Dumuzi's descent to the underworld explained the dying of summer, the time when the heat scorched the green from the landscape, and the flocks grew thin, and the harvest was done, and the earth seemed to be holding its breath before the rains. His return, or his sister Geshtinana's sacrifice that allowed him to spend half the year in the world of the living, explained the return of life. But I think there is something more than agricultural calendar here. The mourning for Dumuzi lasted long after people stopped believing that the seasons were controlled by his literal descent and ascent. The rituals persisted because they were doing something else, something that ritual always does when it persists beyond its original explanatory function. They were holding grief. They were giving a culture a structured, institutionalized, publicly sanctioned way to mourn. Not just Dumuzi specifically, but everything that Dumuzi represented. The pastoral world, the older ways, the shepherd life, the freedom of movement. All of it. The things that the city had replaced. The things that agriculture had displaced. The things that writing down a story in a settled language had already, in a small way, begun to kill. All of it got mourned in the ritual for Dumuzi. The Sumerians were more self-aware about what they had lost than we usually give them credit for. And the echo in Genesis, Abel's blood crying from the ground, God's devastated response, the curse that falls not just on Cain personally, but on the ground itself. That echo is in the same register. It is mourning of the same kind. Not just mourning a person, mourning a world. Names in the ancient Near East were not labels. They were compressed stories, miniature theology. A name could carry a prayer, a statement of faith, a political allegiance, even a whispered complaint addressed to a God who was not listening. When ancient parents named a child, they were making a declaration about reality, about what they believed the world to be, and what they hoped the child would become within it. So, when we read the names Cain and Abel, Cain and Abel in the original Hebrew, we are not just reading names, we are reading the first sentence of a theological argument that the story will spend 16 verses unpacking. Let us start with Cain. The biblical text itself gives us an etymology. When Eve gives birth to her first son, she says, "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord." The Hebrew verb here is qana, to get, to acquire, to possess, and Cain, looks like it is built from that same root. The acquired one, the gotten one, the son obtained after the long exile from Eden, the first human born from a human body, rather than shaped from divine clay. That reading is clean and self-contained, and for centuries, most readers stopped there. But ancient names rarely sit still. They layer. They accumulate meaning the way sediment accumulates in a river delta. Each new reading depositing something on top of the last without erasing what came before. When scholars started looking at Cain's name through the lens of other Semitic languages related to Hebrew, spoken by neighboring peoples in the same broad cultural zone, something interesting appeared. In several of these languages, a word with a similar sound carried a completely different meaning. Smith, metal worker, the one who forges. In Arabic, Cain means smith. In South Arabian inscriptions, the same root appears in the context of metalworking. In some ancient Semitic traditions, the figure of the smith was not just a craftsman, but a culture hero, the one who acquired the dangerous knowledge of fire and metal and brought it back to humanity. A gift, or a curse, or both, because here is what the Bible actually does with Cain's descendants. After Cain is exiled to the land of Nod, after he builds a city and has children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, his lineage becomes the lineage of civilization's inventors. One descendant becomes the father of those who dwell in tents and herd livestock. Another becomes the father of musicians. Another, and notice this, becomes the father of those who forge instruments of bronze and iron. The first murderer's bloodline produces the first metalworkers. Skill and violence knotted together from the very beginning of the human story. If Cain's name echoes a word for smith, if somewhere in the deep etymology of Cain there is a root that connects to fire and metal and the forging of tools, then his story becomes not just a personal tragedy, but a cultural myth. The story of how humanity acquired the power to shape the world and what it cost. Prometheus stole fire from the gods. He was punished forever. Cain took a life. He was cursed to wander. Different stories, same structure. The acquisition of dangerous power always comes at a price. Now, Abel. Hevel in Hebrew. The word means breath, vapor, mist. Something so insubstantial it disappears the moment you close your hand around it. Later in the Hebrew Bible, the same word, Hevel, becomes the signature word of the book of Ecclesiastes. Hevel Havalim, says the preacher. Vapor of vapors. Everything is vapor. Everything is insubstantial. Everything you build and hoard and cherish will dissolve like mist in the morning. If Cain is named for acquisition, for the human drive to get, to possess, to forge, to hold, then Abel is named for the thing that cannot be held, life itself. The breath that God breathed into Adam's nostrils, the spark that can be extinguished by a single act of violence in a field. There is something unbearably deliberate about this, a story in which the one who wants to possess everything kills the one who represents the impossibility of permanent possession. A story in which the acquired murders the breath, But let us go further, because the Mesopotamian dimension of these names adds another layer that is easy to miss. In Sumerian, the concept of the life breath, the animating force that makes a creature alive, was central to their understanding of the divine gift of existence. The Sumerians had words for the sacred breath of life. They had philosophical and theological frameworks built around the idea that life was fundamentally fragile, fundamentally temporary, fundamentally given on loan from the gods and recallable at any moment. This is the world that produced the story of Dumuzi's descent. The world in which the shepherd god, beloved of heaven, could be seized and dragged into darkness with terrifying speed. The world in which no amount of divine favor guaranteed permanence. Hevel, breath, vapor, and on the other side of the pairing, Cain, the forger, the acquirer, the one who will build a city. When you put these two names next to each other, when you feel the weight of one against the insubstantiality of the other, the story is already told before a single event occurs. One brother is going to reach for something. The other is going to slip away. The linguistic fossils are not conclusive evidence of a direct connection between Sumerian mythology and biblical narrative. Etymology is a notoriously slippery discipline. Words drift, sounds change, meanings blur. You can follow an etymology toward a conclusion and find, when you arrive, that the path behind you has dissolved. But here is what I find genuinely extraordinary about these names. Whether or not there is a direct etymological connection to Mesopotamian traditions, whether or not some ancient storyteller consciously chose these names because they echoed older, deeper meanings, the names work. They work as a pair. They work as a commentary on the human condition. They work as a compressed thesis statement for one of the oldest and most persistent questions in human thought. What is it that we can actually keep? We build, we forge, we acquire. We reach out and close our hands around the things we love. And then something happens, in a field, in an argument, in a moment of rage or jealousy, or simply bad luck. And the breath is gone. The names of Cain and Abel have been speaking that sermon for 3,000 years. And the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, impressed 4,000 years ago by hands long since returned to dust, were speaking it before the Hebrew alphabet existed. Same sermon, different mouths, same ache. There is one more linguistic thread worth pulling before we leave this territory. It is more speculative than the others, and I want to be honest about that. But it is strange enough to deserve a moment. Some researchers have wondered about the name Dumuzi itself, the Sumerian shepherd god whose story parallels Abel's in such striking ways. Dumuzi means, most literally, faithful son, or true son of the deep waters. The Du in his name connects to truth, faithfulness, the real. Abel, in Jewish and early Christian interpretation, became associated with faithfulness, with right relationship to the divine, with the kind of offering, sincere, costly, ungrudging, that God could look upon with favor. Faithful son, true son, Dumuzi, Abel. The parallel is there. I cannot prove it is anything more than coincidence, but it has been sitting in the back of my mind since I first read both stories, and it will probably sit in the back of yours too. Some echoes do not need to be explained to be heard. Here is the truth that makes Cain and Abel something more than a family tragedy. It is a story about the most violent transition in human history, not in the dramatic sense, not a war with armies and burning cities, a slower, deeper transition, one that took thousands of years, one that most of the people living through it probably did not even recognize as a transition because it happened across too many generations to see in a single lifetime. The shift from a mobile way of life to a settled one. For most of human history, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands of years here, the vast majority of the time our species has existed, people moved. They followed game. They tracked seasonal plants. They knew the landscape the way a sailor knows the sea, not as something to be owned, but as something to be read, navigated, or worked with. The idea that you could own a piece of ground, that you could say this field belongs to me and my children and their children forever, that idea would have been as alien to our ancestors as the idea of owning a cloud. Then, very slowly, in a few river valleys, something changed. People started to stay. They planted seeds and waited for the harvest. They dug irrigation channels and redirected the river to their fields. They built walls. They stored grain. They accumulated, and in accumulating, they created something that had never existed before. Surplus. More food than you need today. More food than you need this week. A buffer against the future. Surplus creates complexity. Complexity creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates someone who needs to keep track of the surplus, which creates writing, which creates Sumer. But here is what the history books often skip over, because it does not fit the narrative of steady progress. This transition was brutal, not just difficult, not just challenging, genuinely documented, archaeologically verifiable, brutal. The skeletal evidence from early agricultural populations shows increased rates of infectious disease, because you cannot live in close proximity to your own waste and your domesticated animals without creating disease vectors that hunter-gatherers largely avoided. It shows malnutrition because a diet based primarily on grain, however abundant, is less nutritionally complete than the varied diet of foragers. It shows evidence of violence, organized, systematic violence, at rates higher than in pre-agricultural populations. The farmers were not simply healthier and more successful than the people who came before them. In many ways, for many generations, they were worse off. And yet, they kept farming. Because the one thing surplus provides, the one thing that makes all those trade-offs worth accepting, is numbers. You can feed more people per acre with agriculture than with any other strategy. More people means more soldiers. More soldiers means more land. More land means more surplus. The logic is self-amplifying. Agriculture did not win because it was better for individual humans. It won because it was better for groups. And once a group adopts it, neighboring groups who do not adopt it eventually get absorbed, displaced, or destroyed. The pastoralists, the herders, the shepherds, the people who moved with their animals across the open landscape were on the losing side of this transition, not immediately, not completely. The relationship between farmers and herders in the ancient world was complex and interdependent in many ways, but over the long arc of history, the direction of travel was clear. The field was winning, the flock was retreating, and here is why that matters for Cain and Abel. In the Genesis story, Cain the farmer kills Abel the shepherd. the one who represents the settled life, the cultivated ground, the future direction of human history. He is the murderer. Abel, the shepherd, the one who represents the older way, the mobile life, the pastoral tradition. He is the victim. That is not an accident. Think about who was telling this story. The early Israelites, the community that preserved and shaped Genesis, had deep roots in pastoralism. Abraham was a herder. Isaac was a herder. Jacob was a herder. The great patriarchal narratives of Genesis are narratives of people moving with their flocks, digging wells, negotiating grazing rights, in perpetual tension with the settled agricultural communities around them. When those pastoral people looked out at the world, when they saw the farmers in their walled cities, with their irrigation canals and their grain surpluses and their armies, they were looking at the people who were, over the long sweep of history, replacing them, outcompeting them, building a world that had less and less room for the wandering life. So they told a story in which the farmer was the murderer. Not a wicked farmer. Not a cartoon villain. A farmer who was rejected by God, not because he was bad, but because his offering was somehow insufficient, somehow lacking in whatever quality God requires, and who responded to that rejection with violence. The farmer in this reading is not simply a sinner. He is a civilization, a way of organizing human life that, in achieving its dominance, had to destroy something. Abel is not simply a victim. He is a world that was lost, and his blood cries from the ground, the very ground that Cain tilled, the ground that the agricultural world claimed and marked and made its own, because that is where the pastoral world ended up. In the ground. Absorbed, displaced, remembered only in the grief of those who came after. This is not a gentle reading of Cain and Abel. It is not the Sunday school version. But it is, I would argue, the version that sits underneath the text, the one that the original storytellers felt in their bones, even if they could not articulate it in those terms. The Sumerians knew this tension too. Their story of Dumuzi and Enkimdu acknowledges it, processes it, tries to resolve it through Enkimdu's gracious concession and offer of cooperation. Maybe in the period when that version of the story was told, the 3rd millennium BCE, when Sumerian civilization was at or near its peak. The relationship between farmers and herders was still balanced enough that cooperation seemed like the right ending. By the time the Israelite scribes were composing Genesis, the balance had shifted. The farms had spread. The cities had grown. The open range was shrinking. And the ending changed. Let me take this one step further, because I think there is a layer of the story that even the interpretation I just gave you does not fully account for. The question is not just which side wins. The question is what winning costs. Cain wins. Cain kills Abel. Cain survives. Cain goes to the land of Nod and builds a city. His descendants invent music and metalworking and animal husbandry. They create civilization. By every material measure, Cain's line is the successful one. But the ground rejects him. The soil that Cain worked, the ground that absorbed his brother's blood, it will no longer yield to him. He will be a wanderer, and God marks him not to kill him, but to let him live with what he has done, to carry it, to build cities with hands that remember the weight of what they once held. Success does not cleanse the crime. Civilization does not justify the violence at its origin. That is the story's final and most uncomfortable implication. The world we live in, the world of cities and agriculture and accumulated surplus, and all the things that writing and farming and settled civilization made possible, that world has blood at its foundation. Not metaphorical blood, real blood. The blood of the people who were not chosen, not favored, not written into the dominant narrative. Cain builds the city, Abel lies in the field, and the ground remembers. The Sumerians knew this too. You can hear it in their flood stories, in their laments for destroyed cities, in the weeping for Dumuzi year after year as the summer heat killed the green. They knew that success was fragile. They knew that the world could end. They knew that the shepherd who was beloved of heaven could still be dragged to the underworld. Maybe that is why they wept for him every year, not just as ritual, not just as liturgy, as acknowledgement, as grief, as the recognition that something was lost when the farmer won. The rivalry between Cain and Abel is not over. It was never resolved by the murder. The murder only drove it underground, into the earth itself, where the blood of the pastoral world cries out, and the world goes on building cities over it, and the ground remembers. Every city that was ever built was built by someone who chose the field over the flock, and every city that was ever built stands on someone else's home range. There is a piece of biblical scholarship that most general readers never encounter, and I want to bring it in here because it adds a dimension to the Cain and Abel story that completely changes how you read it. The first cities in Genesis are built by Cain's line. Think about that for a moment. The person who commits the world's first murder is also the person who founds the first city, and his descendants, the children of the man marked by God for fratricide, are the inventors of music, of metalworking, of animal husbandry. They are the culture heroes, the bringers of civilization. In the genealogy in Genesis 4, Cain's great-great-great-grandson is Jabal, described as the father of those who dwell in tents and raise livestock. His brother is Jubal, the father of those who play the lyre and the pipe. Their half-brother is Tubal-Cain, who forged all instruments of bronze and iron, tent dwellers, musicians, smiths. The entire material and cultural infrastructure of the ancient world traced back to the bloodline of the first murderer. This is not a mistake. It is not an oversight. The biblical authors knew exactly what they were doing with this genealogy. They were making the claim about the nature of civilization itself, that its foundations are not clean, that the same line that produced violence also produced culture, that you cannot have the city without the blood that was spilled to make room for it. The ground that Cain cursed is the ground that Cain's descendants built on. And here is where the Sumerian parallel becomes most electric. Because in Sumerian tradition, Dumuzi is not just a shepherd, he is the shepherd king. In the Sumerian king list, one of our most important historical documents from ancient Mesopotamia, Dumuzi appears as an early ruler, one of the antediluvian kings reigning before the flood. He is not just mythological, he is historical, or at least the tradition treats him as both simultaneously. The shepherd who was beloved of the goddess was also the king who built the city. And when he descended to the underworld, when he was dragged away from the feasting table to the land of no return, What was lost was not just a person. It was a kind of leadership, a kind of relationship between ruler and land that the ancient world associated with the pastoral, the king as shepherd of his people. That image, the king as shepherd, is so pervasive in the ancient Near East that it becomes almost invisible. Every Mesopotamian king compared himself to a shepherd. Every Egyptian pharaoh carried a crook as a symbol of royal authority. And in the Hebrew Bible, the greatest king Israel ever produced, David, was himself a shepherd before he was a king. The shepherd is not the opposite of the king. The shepherd is the ideal king. So when the story of Cain and Abel sets up a farmer and a shepherd and has God favor the shepherd and then has the farmer kill him, it is not just telling a story about two individual brothers. It is telling a story about what kind of leadership, what kind of relationship to the land and to the people gets killed when civilization takes over. The shepherd king is gone. The farmer king rules in his place. And something about how we relate to our communities, our land, our obligation to the vulnerable, something in that relationship withers when the shepherd is killed. Or at least, that is what the story implies. And that implication is still waiting, in the text, for anyone who reads it slowly enough to feel it. The flood story in Genesis and the flood story in the Sumerian and Babylonian traditions are, at this point, a textbook case of cultural transmission in the ancient world. This is not fringe scholarship. This is not a controversial claim. Every major academic institution that studies the ancient Near East accepts as a working consensus that the story of Noah's Ark was shaped by, or at minimum, deeply influenced by, the much older Mesopotamian flood traditions. The parallels are too specific to be coincidental. A righteous man warned by a god, a great boat built, animals brought aboard, a flood covering the earth, birds sent out to find dry land, a sacrifice offered on dry ground, a covenant made so the destruction will not be repeated. The structural skeleton is the same. The theological flesh is different because the God of Genesis is not the squabbling council of Sumerian deities, and the moral framework of the biblical flood is not the same as the Mesopotamian one. But the bones match, and if the bones of the flood story match, we have to take seriously the possibility that other stories in Genesis show the same pattern, including the one about two brothers. So how does a story travel from Sumer to Israel across a gap of 1,000 years or more? The answer is the same way everything traveled in the ancient world, with people. The ancient Near East was not a collection of isolated bubbles. It was a dense network of trade routes, diplomatic corridors, military campaigns, and population movements. Merchants moved between Mesopotamia and the Levant regularly. Armies moved. Captives moved, brought back by conquering armies to serve in the cities of the victors. Craftsmen moved, following work. Refugees moved, fleeing wars and famines. Diplomats moved, carrying letters and gifts between royal courts. And everywhere people moved, stories moved with them, not as conscious acts of preservation or transmission, not as deliberate attempts to spread one culture's mythology to another, but as the natural, inevitable, invisible way that human beings have always exchanged ideas, in conversation, in song, in the casual retellings that happen around fires and in markets, and at the wells where people gather to draw water. You hear a story. It resonates with something you already know. You carry it with you. You tell it, months or years later, adapted to your own context, your own language, your own concerns. The person who hears it from you does the same. By the time the story has traveled 1,000 miles and 500 years, it has been transformed. New names, new gods, new moral framework, but the skeleton is still there, buried under the new flesh, recognizable to anyone willing to look. The most dramatic moment of cultural transmission between Mesopotamia and Israel was the Babylonian exile. In the 6th century BCE, after a series of disastrous military defeats, Jerusalem fell. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, dismantled the Davidic monarchy, and deported a substantial portion of the Israelite population, particularly the educated elite, the priests and scribes and skilled craftsmen, to Babylon. These exiles spent decades living in the very heartland of Mesopotamian civilization. They walked streets where hymns to Inanna, Dumuzi, Enlil, and Marduk had been sung for 2,000 years. They saw ziggurats. They heard flood stories. They encountered, in the living oral and written culture of Babylon, the mythology that had been shaping Mesopotamian life since before anyone in Israel had learned to write. Imagine being an Israelite priest in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. Everything you knew as permanent is gone. Your city is rubble. Your temple is ash. Your God, the God you told everyone was supreme, who guaranteed your national survival, who had chosen your people, appears to have abandoned you. In that condition, you encounter the Babylonian epic of creation, the story of Atrahasis, which includes both a creation narrative and a great flood. The hymns to Dumuzi, the dying and rising shepherd. The debates between the farmer and the shepherd about which way of life is more worthy of divine favor. What do you do with those stories? You argue with them. You absorb them. You transform them. The Genesis creation stories, scholars have known for over a century that there are actually two distinct creation narratives woven together in Genesis 1 and 2, with slightly different theology and vocabulary, show clear signs of engagement with Babylonian creation myths. The structure, the imagery, the sequence of events all echo the Mesopotamian tradition. But the theology is radically different. Where Babylon has a council of gods and a creation arising from cosmic conflict, Genesis has a single God creating through deliberate, purposeful, moral speech. The transformation is not imitation. It is argument. And that same process, that same act of taking an older story and reshaping it around a new theology may be what happened with Cain and Abel. The Sumerian version ends in negotiation, compromise. The farmer and the shepherd agree to share the land. Inanna chooses the shepherd. The farmer accepts the decision, and life goes on. But the Hebrew scribes were not interested in a story that ended in compromise. They were interested in a story that could carry the full weight of what it means to be human. The jealousy, the rage, the violence, the inability to accept a universe that does not favor you. And then ask the hardest question that follows. What will you do with that anger? When sin crouches at the door, will you master it, or will you let it master you? The Sumerian story says, negotiate. find a way to coexist. The farmer and the shepherd can both be valued. The Hebrew story says, "You will not negotiate, you will kill, and then you will spend the rest of your life carrying what you did in a world where the ground itself has turned against you." Both stories are true. They are true in different registers, answering different questions. The Sumerian story is a story about social organization, about how a civilization manages the tension between two essential and competing ways of life. The Hebrew story is a story about the interior life, about what happens inside a person when they encounter rejection, when they feel unseen, when the universe appears to be unfair, about whether the worst impulse that rises in that moment is something you can resist. These are not the same story, but they are stories in conversation. And that conversation, I would argue, has never ended. We are still having it. Every time someone asks why the universe seems to favor someone else, every time someone burns with the conviction that they worked just as hard, offered just as much, deserved just as well, and found themselves passed over, every time that burning flares into something dangerous, sin is crouching at the door. That image, sin personified as a predator waiting to spring, is the image the Hebrew story chose to describe what Cain was experiencing before he killed his brother. Not madness, not a moment of uncontrolled rage, a choice, a predator that could have been mastered. The Sumerian story does not have that moment. Enkimdu does not struggle with a predator at the door. He simply accepts the outcome and moves on. Maybe that is the deepest difference between the two traditions. The Sumerian story assumes that humans, given the right social conditions, will negotiate their way through rivalry. The Hebrew story assumes that inside every rivalry is a predator, and that the work of becoming human is learning to master it. Neither assumption is wrong. Both are true of different moments in different people's lives, and both, I think, are true of the same moment in the same life if we are being honest about what the inside of a person looks like when they have been rejected. The clay tablets knew that. The scribes of ancient Israel knew that. They were writing about you. Here is where I have to be honest with you about the limits of what we know. The connections I have been drawing tonight between Dumuzi and Abel, between Enkimdu and Cain, between Sumerian mythology and the book of Genesis are real. They are recognized by scholars. They are not fabrications or fringe theories. But they are also not settled. Not everyone who has studied these texts agrees on what the parallels mean, how they arose, or how direct the connection is. There are, broadly, 3 camps, and understanding the debate helps you understand not just these specific stories, but the larger question of how human culture actually works, how ideas travel, mutate, survive, and find new forms. The first camp argues for direct influence. In this view, the line runs something like this. Sumerian myths about shepherds and farmers, divine favor and rejection, descent and death were composed in the 3rd millennium BCE. They circulated in cuneiform tablets for centuries. As Semitic-speaking peoples rose to dominance in Mesopotamia, the Akkadians, then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians, they inherited and adapted this literary tradition. The stories kept circulating in new languages and new contexts, but with the same structural bones. Israelite scribes, particularly those exposed to Babylonian culture during the exile, encountered this material and engaged with it consciously. They were not plagiarists. They were arguing with the tradition, rewriting it to carry their own theological vision. The echoes in Genesis are intentional. They are a sign of engagement, not of unconscious absorption. This is the strongest version of the influence argument, and it has genuine evidence behind it, particularly for the flood narrative, where the parallels are too precise to explain any other way. The second camp argues for parallel development. In this view, the similarities between Sumerian mythology and biblical narrative do not require any direct connection. They can be explained by the simple fact that human beings, facing the same fundamental challenges, tend to produce the same fundamental stories. Farming and herding are universal human activities. The tension between them is universal. Divine favor and its inexplicable distribution, why some people seem blessed and others seem cursed, that is a universal human experience. Sibling rivalry is universal. Violence arising from jealousy is universal. Given all of that, is it surprising that multiple cultures, working independently, produced stories that look similar? Maybe the parallels are not evidence of transmission. Maybe they are evidence of convergence, the way different rivers, starting from different mountains, all end up flowing toward the sea. This view has merit too, and it is a necessary corrective to the tendency to see influence everywhere, to connect dots that may be coincidental. The third camp, the one I find most intellectually satisfying, though it is also the most difficult to test, argues for a common source now lost. Imagine, before writing existed, before any of these stories were pressed into clay or copied onto papyrus, a reservoir of oral tradition spread across a wide area of the ancient Near East. Stories told around fires, at wells, in seasonal gatherings, by wandering storytellers who moved between communities. Stories about rival siblings, about divine favor and its mysteries, about shepherds and farmers and the gods who watched them. Those oral stories, or rather, the patterns within those stories, became the common property of multiple cultures simultaneously. When the Sumerians developed writing and began recording their mythology, they drew on this shared reservoir. When, centuries later, Israelite scribes composed Genesis, they drew on it too, not from each other, necessarily, from the same deep well. In this view, Dumuzi and Abel are not related as original and copy. They are cousins, both descended from a common ancestor story, an ancestor that existed only as sound, as breath, as the living voice of someone who has been gone for 5,000 years. A story older than writing itself. We cannot prove this theory. By definition, oral tradition before writing is invisible to us. It leaves no direct evidence. We can infer its existence from the patterns we see in later texts, but we cannot reconstruct it. The common ancestor is a ghost. What I can tell you is this: the debate between these three positions is not just an academic argument about ancient texts. It is a debate about how human culture actually works, about whether ideas spread primarily through contact and transmission, or whether they arise independently when similar conditions produce similar pressures, or whether there is a layer of shared human experience so fundamental that it produces the same stories regardless of time and place. All three mechanisms are real. All three happen. The question is, which one is responsible for any particular set of parallels? For Cain and Abel and the Sumerian tradition, the honest answer is, we do not know for certain. The flood narrative gives us a clean case of transmission. The Cain and Abel story gives us something murkier, a set of parallels that could be explained by any of the three mechanisms, or by some combination of all three. But here is what I want you to take away from the scholarly debate, regardless of which explanation turns out to be correct. The parallels exist: a farmer and a shepherd, divine favor and divine rejection, a rivalry, a death, blood in the ground, the earth mourning, an exile imposed on the survivor. Those elements appear in Sumerian texts 4,000 years ago. They appear in Genesis 3,000 years ago. And they appear in our imagination tonight, lying in the dark, listening to a story that somehow still matters. That is not nothing. That is everything. Because whatever mechanism carried these patterns from one culture to another, whether it was direct transmission, or parallel development, or a common ancestor we can no longer hear, the fact that they survived, the fact that they kept being told, the fact that they found new form after new form across millennia and languages and theologies says something important. These stories are not accidental. They are the shapes that human experience takes when it tries to understand itself. And we have been trying to understand this particular shape, the shape of divine favor, mysteriously distributed, of jealousy that becomes violence, of the impossible question of why some offerings are accepted and others are not, for longer than civilization has existed. We may be trying to understand it for as long as civilization continues. I want to spend a moment on the question of silence, because one of the most significant things about the Cain and Abel story is not what it says, but what it refuses to say. Why did God reject Cain's offering? The text does not tell us. Thousands of years of commentary have tried to fill this gap. The ancient rabbis suggested that Cain's offering lacked intention. He went through the motions, but his heart was not in it. Christian theologians developed the idea that Abel's blood sacrifice was inherently more pleasing to God, anticipating later Christian theology about blood atonement. Modern literary scholars suggest the gap is intentional, that the story is about rejection without cause, and to make Cain's and our experience of unexplained divine disfavor as raw and unmediated as possible. But none of these explanations are in the text. They are all additions, glosses, attempts to make the story more comfortable by giving it a reason. The text, deliberately, has no reason. And I think that silence is the point, because the experience the story is describing, the experience of working hard, of giving what you have, of doing what you believe is right, and finding that it is not enough, that something about you is somehow insufficient, that another person who seems no better than you has been favored for reasons you cannot identify. That experience does not come with reasons. That is precisely what makes it so destabilizing. If you knew why you were rejected, you could fix it. You could change. You could work harder, or offer more, recalibrate. But when the rejection is inexplicable, when God simply does not look with favor and no one will tell you why, There is nowhere to direct the resulting fury except outward, at the person who was accepted when you were not, at the person who did not ask to be favored but was, at the person whose existence, simply by being chosen, proves that you were not. That is the mechanism of the story, and it is a mechanism the Sumerians recognized too. Their gods were not always explicable. Enlil could destroy a city that had been faithful for generations. Inanna could condemn the husband she loved. The divine favor could be withdrawn without warning and without cause. One Sumerian lament, a text called the Lament for the Destruction of Sumer and Ur, spends thousands of lines describing the devastation of Sumerian civilization, and not once does it suggest that Sumer deserved what happened. The city was faithful, the temples were maintained, the offerings were given, and still the god An turned away his face, and Enlil looked with disfavor, and the city fell. Divine favor withdrawn without explanation. Cain and Abel. The Sumerians had been sitting with that mystery for 1,000 years before Genesis was written. They had put it into their literature, their rituals, their laments. They had built an entire theology around the terrifying, irreducible arbitrariness of divine favor. And the Hebrew authors, when they composed their version of the farmer and shepherd story, kept that mystery intact, kept the silence where the explanation should be, kept the void where the reason should live, because they knew, as the Sumerians knew, that the mystery was not a problem to be solved. It was the condition of human life, the one that every religion, every philosophy, every sleepless night at 3 a.m. has been trying to find a way to live with. Why them and not me? The clay tablets do not answer. Genesis does not answer. And 4,000 years later, lying in the dark with the question still resonant in your chest, you do not answer either. You just breathe. Hevel, breath, and keep going. There is one element of the Cain and Abel story that never quite gets the attention it deserves. Not the murder, not the curse, not even the question of why God rejected Cain's offering. The mark. After Cain has murdered his brother, after the curse has been pronounced, after Cain has complained that his punishment is more than he can bear, after he has expressed not remorse, but fear that whoever finds him will kill him in revenge, God does something unexpected. God protects him. The Lord put a mark on Cain, the text says, so that no one who found him would kill him. And more than that, the Lord said that if anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him 7-fold. God becomes the protector of the first murderer. Think about how strange that is. Think about how different it is from what we might expect. The God who refused Cain's offering, whose rejection triggered the entire catastrophe, that same God now steps in to ensure that the man who committed the world's first murder will not be killed. Cain is not destroyed. He is marked. He is preserved. He is given a kind of terrible, ambivalent gift, the ability to continue living with what he has done. What is the mark of Cain? Theologians and scholars and artists and novelists have been arguing about that for 3,000 years. It has been interpreted as a physical brand, a visible sign on his body, a changed appearance. Some ancient interpreters suggested his face became monstrous, others that it became luminous. Some readings suggest the mark was a letter from God's name, written on his forehead. Others have proposed it was an animal or a natural phenomenon, a horn, a dog. Some visible protection. The text does not say, and that silence is deliberate because the mark of Cain is meant to be mysterious. It is meant to make you uncomfortable. It is meant to resist the simple reading that the story is about a bad man being punished, because here is the uncomfortable truth the story is building toward. The world Cain builds is our world. His descendants invent music, they invent metal tools, they develop animal husbandry. Ironic, given that Abel was the shepherd. They build cities, they create everything that we call civilization. The lineage of the murderer is the lineage of culture itself. And so the mark, whatever it was, is not simply a sign of guilt. It is a sign of preservation. God ensured that Cain would live long enough to build the world we inherited. The world built by marked hands. The world built by someone who knew what it was to be rejected, who responded to rejection with the worst possible choice, and who then had to live with it. Every city has a Cain in its founding story if you look hard enough. The Sumerians knew this, not through the same theological framework, not through the lens of one righteous God making a moral judgment, but through the raw historical experience of watching cities rise and fall, of watching the shepherd give way to the farmer, of watching the flocks retreat before the advancing fields. Dumuzi descended to the underworld, and the land mourned. But the land did not stay dead. The seasons returned, the grain grew, the cities rebuilt. The shepherd was gone, but the farmer kept building. And every spring, when the rains came and the fields turned green, the Sumerians went to their temples and wept for Dumuzi. They wept for what was lost. They celebrated what remained. They held both things at once, grief and gratitude, mourning and life, because that is the only honest response to a world built on loss. Maybe the mark of Cain is not a punishment at all. Maybe it is the mark of complexity. The sign that this person, this flawed, violent, creative, constructive, destructive person is going to be part of the story from now on, is going to build things and break things and keep going regardless. The mark that says, this is what it means to be human, not the shepherd's innocence, not the pure offering freely given. The marked face, the wandering, the city built by someone who already knows what they are capable of, and still building. You are lying in the dark right now, thousands of years after the last Sumerian priest pressed the last mark into wet clay, thousands of years after the Hebrew scribes composed Genesis in a Babylonian exile, trying to hold their identity together in a foreign land. Thousands of years after a first reader looked at those 16 verses and asked the same question every reader asks: why Abel? Why not Cain? What is the difference that matters? And you are still asking it. That is not an accident. It is not simple tradition. It is not just that these stories were handed down through religious institutions that enforced their preservation. It is that these stories are true. Not true in the sense that Cain and Abel were historical individuals who actually existed in a literal field, in a literal land, east of a literal garden. Maybe they were. Maybe they were not. That question is genuinely less interesting than the question of what the story knows. And what the story knows what the Sumerian story about Dumuzi and Enkimdu knows, what the Hebrew story about Cain and Abel knows, what all the versions and echoes and transmissions of this fundamental narrative know, is something about the interior of a human life that has not changed. The experience of rejection is the same now as it was 4,000 years ago. The question that follows rejection, why them and not me? What did I do wrong? Was it something about me, something fundamental, something that no amount of effort will ever fix? That question is the same. And the predator that crouches at the door after rejection, the one that the God of Genesis warned Cain about, the one that is not madness, but choice, the one you can master or be mastered by, that predator has not gone anywhere. It crouches for all of us. In our best moments, we master it. In our worst moments, we do not. The ancient storytellers who shaped these narratives were not writing theology from a distance. They were writing from inside the experience. The Sumerian priest who chanted the laments for Dumuzi knew what it felt like to watch something beloved disappear. The Israelite scribe who composed the story of Cain's angry fallen face knew what it felt like to stand outside divine favor, to have done everything you thought was right and found it was not enough. They put those feelings into the oldest technology humanity ever invented: story. And 4,000 years later, the feelings survived the technology. The technology decayed, the clay crumbled, the papyrus dissolved, the ink faded, but the feelings were carried forward in new vessels, new languages, new theological frameworks, new contexts, the same ache. There is a theory in narrative psychology that stories do not just describe human experience, they shape it. That the stories a culture tells about how the world works become, over time, the lens through which individuals in that culture perceive their own lives, the available scripts for understanding what is happening to you. If that theory is right, and the evidence for it is compelling, then the story of Cain and Abel has been shaping the way human beings understand rejection and jealousy and violence for 3,000 years at minimum. Probably longer, if the Sumerian roots go where the parallels suggest they go. Every person who has ever burned with the feeling that the universe is unfair has had that feeling framed, consciously or not, by this story. The narrative of divine favoritism, of the inexplicable preference for one offering over another, has provided the template through which millions of people have processed their most painful experiences. That is an enormous amount of power for 16 verses to hold. And it raises a question I want to leave you with. Not answer, leave you with. Because I think it is the kind of question that does its best work when you sit with it in the dark. If the Sumerian version is older, if the original telling ended not in murder, but in negotiation, not in blood, but in compromise, not in a curse, but in the farmer and the shepherd working out how to share the same landscape. What does that tell us? Does it tell us that the Hebrew version represents a kind of fall, a pessimistic rewriting of a story that was originally more hopeful? Or does it tell us that the Hebrew version is more honest, that the Sumerian ending, as beautiful as it is, represents a wish, the wish that rivalry could be resolved through eloquence and grace, while the Hebrew ending tells the truth about what actually happens when one person feels fundamentally rejected by the universe? I do not know the answer, I am not sure anyone does. But I know this. The Sumerians wept for their shepherd every year, even after he was taken. Even after the fields grew over the places where his flocks had grazed. Even after the cities swallowed the open range, they wept for him. They kept his name in their mouths. They refused to let the loss be simply a loss. And maybe that is the deepest wisdom in all of this. Not the answer to why Cain's offering was rejected. Not the solution to the mystery of divine favor. Not even the explanation of how these stories traveled from clay tablets in Sumer to the scrolls that shaped Western civilization. Maybe the deepest wisdom is simply this. Keep saying the name of what was lost. Let the blood speak from the ground. Do not be in such a hurry to cover it over with cities and fields and all the things that the successful side of history builds. The shepherd is in the ground. The shepherd has always been in the ground. And the ground, if you press your ear to it in the right kind of silence, is still speaking. You are part of that unbroken chain. From the first person who pressed a reed into wet clay and made a mark that meant something, to you, the lying in the dark right now, carrying the same questions in a different body. The tablets are waiting. The story is not over. Sleep well. The questions will still be there in the morning. And that is exactly as it should be.